The easiest way to expose a person's character is to give them someone they believe they are better than. By the time the members of Hawthorne Country Club realized how wrong they had been, the quiet young woman they laughed at would become the very reason one of their own returned home safely that unforgettable afternoon. The country club rested on rolling green hills just outside a prosperous American town, where perfectly trimmed fairways stretched beneath bright blue skies and elegant white buildings reflected decades of wealth, prestige, and tradition. Luxury vehicles filled the parking area every weekend as successful business owners, respected attorneys, physicians, and longtime community leaders gathered to enjoy golf tournaments, charity lunches, and private social events. Membership was considered a symbol of status, and many believed the club represented the finest people the community had to offer. On a warm Saturday morning, a 25-year-old woman named Grace Parker quietly walked through the front entrance, wearing a simple light blue dress beneath a modest sweater. Her appearance stood in sharp contrast to the designer outfits surrounding her, yet her kind smile and gentle eyes revealed a confidence that required no expensive clothing. Grace had been invited by an elderly neighbor who recently became a member and needed someone to accompany her because walking long distances had become difficult. Grace happily agreed, not because she cared about the club, but because she believed helping others was always worth her time. As she carefully supported the older woman toward the dining terrace, several members paused their conversations and glanced in her direction. A few exchanged amused smiles. One woman quietly whispered, "She looks completely out of place." Another chuckled softly before adding, "Maybe she thought this was a public park." Their comments spread through nearby tables with uncomfortable laughter. Grace heard enough to understand exactly what they meant, yet she simply continued walking with calm dignity, making certain her elderly companion reached a comfortable chair overlooking the golf course. She thanked a server who brought fresh lemonade, adjusted the older woman's sun hat to shield her from the bright sunshine, and asked whether she needed anything else before taking a seat nearby. Her quiet kindness attracted little attention compared with the entertainment some members found in judging appearances. A group gathered near the clubhouse entrance continued making light-hearted remarks about how membership standards must be changing. One man even joked that someone should explain the club's dress expectations before the next luncheon. Grace never responded. She simply smiled politely whenever someone passed her table and spent the afternoon listening to stories from her elderly neighbor about the community's history. Unknown to everyone watching, Grace had completed extensive emergency response and community safety training several years earlier while volunteering with local organizations. She rarely mentioned it because she never believed kindness required recognition, and she viewed practical skills as opportunities to help rather than accomplishments to display. Across the terrace, the club's longtime president noticed the quiet young woman, but quickly dismissed her as an unremarkable guest. He had no idea that before the sunset, the person many members considered least impressive would become the only one prepared to remain calm when an unexpected emergency changed the entire atmosphere of Hawthorne Country Club, leaving every whispered judgment suspended in stunned silence. Grace remained beside her elderly neighbor for the rest of the morning, completely unaffected by the quiet remarks drifting across the terrace. The laughter that occasionally reached her table never changed the gentle expression on her face, because she had learned long ago that another person's opinion could never determine her worth. She poured fresh iced tea for the older woman, carefully adjusted the blanket covering her knees when a light breeze crossed the hillside, and listened attentively as stories from decades earlier unfolded one memory at a time. Every few minutes another member walked past wearing expensive golf attire, polished shoes, and designer sunglasses. Some offered polite greetings to the elderly member while barely acknowledging Grace's presence. Others simply glanced toward her simple light blue dress before continuing their conversations as though she did not belong in the elegant surroundings. Grace never appeared uncomfortable. She admired the peaceful scenery stretching across the fairways, watched families enjoying the sunshine, and quietly appreciated the opportunity to spend meaningful time with someone who valued companionship more than appearances. The elderly woman finally smiled and said, "You know, My late husband always believed character revealed itself in places where people expected status instead of kindness. Grace returned the smile. Then he must have been a very wise man. Meanwhile, inside the grand clubhouse, several members continued discussing the young guest. One businessman joked that exclusive clubs should remain exclusive. Another woman wondered aloud why someone dressed so modestly had even been invited. Their comments were never openly cruel, but they carried the unmistakable tone of people who believed outward appearance reflected personal value. The club president overheard pieces of the conversation and chose not to interrupt because he assumed the remarks would quickly fade away. Unknown to everyone present, Grace had spent the previous 5 years volunteering at community events, neighborhood preparedness programs, and local emergency response workshops. She believed every citizen should know how to remain calm during unexpected situations because ordinary people often became the first source of help before professional responders arrived. She completed advanced first aid instruction, participated in disaster preparedness exercises, and regularly assisted older adults during community safety programs. She never displayed certificates or discussed her training because she considered those skills personal responsibilities rather than achievements deserving attention. Shortly before noon, the elderly woman grew tired and decided to rest inside the shaded clubhouse lounge. Grace escorted her carefully across the stone pathway, thanked a staff member who opened the door, and helped her settle comfortably into a quiet chair overlooking the golf course. After making certain she had everything she needed, Grace stepped outside to enjoy the fresh air for a few moments. Across the 18th fairway, an annual charity golf tournament entered its final round as dozens of members gathered near the finishing hole. Applause echoed across the hills while golf carts quietly moved between spectators. Children laughed near the clubhouse fountain, servers prepared refreshments beneath white tents, and the entire afternoon seemed perfectly ordinary. Yet Grace instinctively noticed something many others overlooked. Dark clouds had quietly begun forming beyond the distant tree line, and a strong wind shifted unexpectedly across the course. She looked toward the horizon for several thoughtful seconds before calmly scanning the surrounding area, recognizing subtle signs she remembered from emergency preparedness training. While most guests continued celebrating beneath the bright afternoon sky, Grace felt an uneasy sense that the peaceful atmosphere surrounding Hawthorne Country Club was about to change far more quickly than anyone expected. Grace continued watching the distant horizon while the celebration carried on without concern. The breeze that had felt refreshing only minutes earlier now arrived in short, uneven bursts, gently lifting tablecloths beneath the white hospitality tents and causing small flags near the clubhouse entrance to flutter more sharply. Most guests barely noticed the change. Their attention remained focused on the final golfers approaching the 18th green, where applause rose each time another successful putt found the cup. The club president congratulated tournament participants, photographers prepared group pictures, and servers carried silver trays filled with refreshments across the terrace. To everyone else, it appeared to be another perfect afternoon at Hawthorne Country Club. Grace quietly stepped toward the edge of the terrace and looked across the open fairways once more. Years of community emergency preparedness training had taught her that weather often announced itself through subtle details long before official warnings arrived. She noticed birds changing direction together, tree branches swaying with unusual rhythm, and a distant line of dark clouds growing taller against the western sky. None of those signs guaranteed immediate danger, but together they suggested conditions could change much faster than people expected. Rather than creating unnecessary concern, Grace calmly approached one of the clubhouse employees and gently asked whether the club monitored local weather alerts during outdoor events. The young employee smiled politely and explained that management normally received notifications if anything serious developed. Before Grace could respond, a nearby member overheard the conversation and laughed softly. "I think we can trust the professionals to tell us if it rains," he joked. Another member added with an amused smile, "She has only been here a few hours and already wants to manage the country club." Several people chuckled before returning to their conversations. Grace simply thanked the employee and walked back toward the shaded terrace without another word. She had never believed every observation required an argument. Inside the clubhouse lounge, her elderly neighbor rested comfortably while reading a local magazine. Grace checked on her, offered another glass of water, and quietly suggested remaining indoors a little longer because the weather might become unsettled later that afternoon. The older woman trusted Grace completely and happily agreed. Outside, the championship group prepared to finish the tournament as more spectators gathered around the final green. Families lined the walking paths, children pointed excitedly toward the golfers, and golf carts moved steadily between viewing areas carrying guests from one hole to another. The club president proudly welcomed several visiting sponsors who had arrived for the award ceremony, completely unaware that the calm schedule planned weeks in advance would soon disappear. A faint vibration sounded from Grace's mobile phone. She glanced at the screen and saw a regional weather advisory recommending heightened awareness because rapidly developing storm cells had been detected several counties away. The notice did not predict immediate danger, but it confirmed exactly what her instincts had already suggested. Grace quietly slipped the phone back into her pocket and looked across the crowded course once again. Near the far edge of the 18th fairway, she noticed one elderly club member choosing to drive a golf cart alone along a path leading toward a wooded section beyond the spectators. At that exact moment, the wind shifted dramatically. The bright afternoon sunlight faded behind thickening clouds, and somewhere beyond the distant hills the first low roll of thunder echoed softly enough that only a handful of people stopped to listen. The distant rumble of thunder rolled across the hills a second time, louder now, causing several golfers to pause briefly before continuing toward the clubhouse. Most guests still believed the weather would simply bring a passing shower, but Grace noticed the wind strengthening with unusual speed. White tablecloths snapped sharply beneath the hospitality tents, tree branches along the edge of the course bent farther than before, and the peaceful afternoon atmosphere slowly gave way to growing uncertainty. The club president finally glanced toward the darkening sky and instructed several employees to begin moving outdoor decorations inside, believing it was merely a precaution. Spectators casually gathered their belongings while tournament officials announced that the award ceremony would be delayed if the weather continued changing. Grace quietly stepped outside the clubhouse entrance and scanned the course one more time. Her eyes immediately returned to the elderly member she had noticed earlier. His golf cart had nearly reached a narrow path beside a small wooded area, farther away from the main crowd than anyone else. At almost the same moment, a powerful gust of wind swept across the fairway, scattering scorecards and lightweight signs into the air. Several people instinctively turned toward the clubhouse, but the elderly member continued driving, apparently unaware that conditions were becoming increasingly difficult. Grace looked toward the nearest staff member. "Please let the clubhouse know someone is still heading toward the wooded path," she said calmly. The employee nodded but appeared uncertain, assuming the golfer would simply return on his own. Another nearby member overheard Grace and smiled dismissively. "He has been playing here for 30 years. I think he knows his own golf course." A few others quietly agreed before continuing inside to avoid the approaching weather. Grace did not argue. She simply watched as another sudden gust pushed leaves and small branches across the cart path. Then her phone vibrated again. This time the regional weather alert displayed stronger language, warning of rapidly developing severe wind conditions in the immediate area and recommending that everyone seek sturdy shelter without delay. Grace immediately walked toward the clubhouse manager and politely showed him the alert. The manager's expression changed as he compared it with the club's weather monitor, which had just begun receiving the same advisory. Within seconds, he instructed employees to direct every guest indoors. Calm announcements echoed across the property while golf carts began returning toward the clubhouse from different directions. Most members followed the instructions without difficulty, but one employee suddenly looked toward the western edge of the course and spoke with visible concern. "The gentleman on the wooded path has not turned around." Several staff members searched the fairway, but heavy trees partially blocked their view. The club president frowned, realizing they had temporarily lost sight of one of their oldest members. Employees hurried to organize assistance, yet no one seemed certain who could safely reach the isolated section of the course before conditions worsened. Grace quietly studied the property map displayed beside the entrance and immediately recognized an alternate maintenance path leading toward the same location while avoiding the most exposed hillside. Without raising her voice or seeking attention, she calmly explained the route to the manager. He looked at her with growing surprise, suddenly realizing that the quiet guest many people had overlooked understood exactly how to respond while everyone else struggled to decide what to do next. The clubhouse manager wasted no time once Grace explained the alternate maintenance route. He immediately called 2 groundskeepers by radio and pointed toward the narrow service path hidden behind the maintenance building. Unlike the exposed cart trail crossing the open fairway, the maintenance road followed lower ground protected by rows of mature oak trees before connecting with the wooded section where the missing member had last been seen. The manager looked at Grace with growing respect. "How did you notice that route?" Grace answered calmly. "Emergency planning always begins by identifying more than one safe way to reach people." There was no pride in her voice, only quiet certainty. Another strong gust swept across the property as employees hurried to move everyone inside the clubhouse. Rain had not yet begun, but the sky had darkened enough to convince even the most confident members that conditions were changing rapidly. The club president stepped beside the manager, watching the maintenance vehicle prepare to leave. He hesitated for a moment before asking Grace, "Would you help us guide the response?" Grace nodded without hesitation. She quickly reviewed the property map one more time, suggested maintaining constant radio communication, and reminded everyone to keep unnecessary vehicles away from the wooded path so emergency access would remain clear. Her calm instructions immediately brought order to the situation. Employees who only an hour earlier had barely noticed her now listened carefully to every recommendation she offered. Several minutes passed with growing tension. Guests gathered quietly inside the large windows overlooking the course while watching the maintenance vehicle disappear beyond the trees. The room that had once echoed with casual laughter now remained almost completely silent. The same members who had joked about Grace's appearance earlier that day found themselves looking toward her for reassurance. She remained composed, occasionally checking updated weather information on her phone while encouraging everyone to stay calm until the response team reported back. Finally, the manager's radio crackled to life. One of the groundskeepers announced that they had located the elderly member beside the maintenance trail after he had wisely stopped driving when visibility became poor. His golf cart had become difficult to move because of fallen branches scattered across the narrow path, leaving him unable to return before the stronger winds arrived. Thankfully, he remained alert and unharmed. Following Grace's suggested route, the maintenance team reached him quickly, helped him into the larger utility vehicle, secured his belongings, and began the careful drive back toward the clubhouse before conditions worsened further. A quiet wave of relief spread across the room. Several people closed their eyes with gratitude while others released long breaths they had not realized they were holding. The club president slowly turned toward Grace, recognizing that her calm observation, practical knowledge, and willingness to help had made the difference between confusion and an organized response. Grace simply smiled gently and asked whether someone had prepared a warm blanket and fresh water for the returning member, because unexpected situations could be emotionally exhausting even when everything ended safely. No one spoke for several moments. The same woman who had earlier been dismissed as someone who did not belong had become the steady presence everyone instinctively trusted. As the clubhouse doors finally opened and the returning vehicle appeared through the light rain, the members standing near the entrance realized that the greatest lesson of the day had nothing to do with wealth, prestige, or exclusive memberships. It had everything to do with the quiet strength of the person they had judged before they ever took the time to know her. The maintenance vehicle rolled slowly into the clubhouse parking area just as the first steady raindrops began falling across the golf course. Employees hurried forward with umbrellas, while the elderly member stepped carefully from the vehicle wearing a grateful smile. He appeared tired, but completely unharmed. A warm blanket was gently placed around his shoulders exactly as Grace had suggested, and a staff member immediately brought him a cup of hot tea. The atmosphere inside the clubhouse transformed almost instantly from anxious silence into quiet relief. Family members embraced the returning gentleman, tournament participants applauded softly, and several employees thanked the groundskeepers for their quick response. Yet the groundskeepers themselves immediately pointed toward Grace. "We only reached him so quickly because she recognized the maintenance route before any of us did," one of them explained. The clubhouse manager nodded in complete agreement. "She organized everything while the rest of us were still trying to decide where to begin." The room fell silent once again, but this silence felt entirely different from the one earlier that afternoon. It was no longer filled with judgment. It was filled with respect. The club president slowly walked toward Grace, his expression carrying genuine humility. "Miss Parker," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. Earlier today, I watched people question whether you belonged here, and I failed to stop it. Instead of recognizing your character, we judged your appearance. Today, you reminded every one of us what true leadership actually looks like." Grace offered the same gentle smile she had worn since arriving that morning. "Anyone with the right knowledge would have wanted to help," she answered softly. "The important thing is that everyone is safe." One of the women who had laughed at Grace near the terrace earlier stepped forward with visible embarrassment. "I made unfair assumptions about you before I even introduced myself," she admitted. "I am truly sorry." Another member quietly nodded. "So am I. We spent more time noticing your clothes than noticing your kindness." Grace accepted every apology with calm grace, never mentioning the remarks she had overheard or the uncomfortable moments she had experienced. She simply thanked them for their honesty and encouraged everyone to continue checking on the elderly member until he felt completely comfortable again. The club president invited everyone into the main dining room, where the delayed charity luncheon quietly resumed. This time the conversation sounded different. Instead of discussing expensive vacations, business deals, or championship scores, members spoke about preparedness, compassion, community service, and the importance of remaining calm during unexpected situations. Many people gathered around Grace, asking where she had learned so much about emergency response. She explained that she had spent years volunteering in community preparedness programs because she believed practical knowledge became meaningful only when used to help other people. There was no attempt to impress anyone, only quiet sincerity. The elderly member eventually stood and slowly raised his teacup toward Grace. "Young lady," he said with deep appreciation, "today you reminded all of us that character can never be measured by appearances." His simple words settled gently across the dining room. Even the members who had spoken the least throughout the afternoon found themselves reflecting on everything they had witnessed. Outside, the rain gradually softened as sunlight slowly broke through the clouds once again, casting warm golden light across the quiet fairways. Looking through the clubhouse windows, the club president quietly realized that the most valuable lesson ever learned at Hawthorne Country Club had not been taught on a golf course. It had been taught by the one guest almost everyone had underestimated before she ever spoke a single important word. The storm passed as quietly as it had arrived, leaving behind fresh air, rain-soaked fairways, and a silence that invited reflection rather than conversation. Inside the clubhouse, the annual luncheon resumed, but no one seemed interested in returning to the subjects that had filled the room only hours earlier. The expensive golf equipment, polished trophies, and elegant surroundings suddenly felt less important than the simple lesson every person present had just witnessed. Grace remained exactly as she had been from the moment she arrived. She helped the catering staff rearrange tables after the unexpected interruption, carried extra blankets to older guests who still felt chilled from the changing weather, and quietly thanked the groundskeepers whose quick cooperation had brought the elderly member safely back. She accepted every expression of gratitude with genuine humility, always redirecting praise toward the teamwork that had made the successful response possible. The club president watched her from across the dining room, realizing that the person who had displayed the greatest leadership throughout the afternoon had never held a title, worn an expensive blazer, or asked anyone to recognize her efforts. Leadership, he now understood, could appear through calm actions long before it appeared through authority. As coffee and dessert were served, the elderly member who had been safely escorted back asked if he could address everyone for a brief moment. Conversations gradually faded until the room became completely quiet. He slowly stood beside his chair, still wrapped in the warm blanket Grace had requested for him earlier, and looked around the room with thoughtful eyes. "I have belonged to this club for more than 30 years, he began softly. During those years, I have watched hundreds of people walk through these doors. Some arrived with impressive careers. Others arrived with remarkable achievements. Yet today I learned that the most valuable quality a person can bring into this building is neither success nor reputation. It is the willingness to help another person without expecting anything in return." His eyes turned toward Grace. "Young lady, before today, many of us noticed only what you were wearing. We completely failed to notice who you truly were. That mistake belongs to us, not to you." Several members quietly lowered their heads, remembering the careless remarks made that morning. One by one, they approached Grace to introduce themselves properly, some for the first time all day. They asked about her volunteer work, her emergency preparedness experience, and the community programs she supported. Grace answered every question warmly, never making anyone feel uncomfortable for what had happened earlier. She spoke far more about the importance of neighbors helping neighbors than about her own accomplishments. The club president finally stepped forward holding a membership invitation that had originally been prepared for another guest. He smiled respectfully and said, "Whether you ever choose to accept this invitation or not, I hope you will always know that you are welcome here because of your character, not because of your clothing or social status." Grace accepted the envelope with appreciation but answered gently, "Thank you. Your kindness today means more than any membership ever could." Those simple words settled deeply into every heart in the room. Looking through the large clubhouse windows, the members watched the evening sunlight slowly break through the departing clouds, covering the rain-washed course with a warm golden glow. It seemed as though the entire landscape had become brighter after the storm had passed. At that quiet moment, everyone present understood that the greatest transformation had not happened outside on the golf course. It had happened inside their own hearts, where first impressions had finally given way to genuine respect, and where one humble young woman had reminded an entire community that true dignity never depends upon appearances. Several weeks passed after the unforgettable afternoon, and Hawthorne Country Club quietly began changing in ways that no renovation or new championship could ever accomplish. Members who once hurried past employees now paused to learn their names. Volunteers became regular participants at the club's charity events instead of occasional guests. Conversations that had once revolved around prestige and accomplishments gradually made room for discussions about community service, preparedness, and genuine kindness. The club president often reflected on how one unexpected day had reshaped the culture of a place that had existed for generations. Grace returned to her ordinary life without seeking recognition. She continued helping her elderly neighbor with weekly errands, volunteered at local community preparedness workshops, and quietly participated in neighborhood outreach programs exactly as she had long before anyone at the club knew her name. She politely declined every opportunity to speak publicly about what had happened because she believed the lesson belonged to everyone, not to herself. Whenever people thanked her for remaining calm during the emergency, she simply answered that preparation becomes meaningful only when it helps someone else. One bright Saturday morning, Hawthorne Country Club hosted another community charity event. This time the atmosphere felt remarkably different. Families from across the town attended together, volunteers worked beside longtime members, and local organizations set up educational booths throughout the clubhouse grounds. At the entrance stood a new sign welcoming every guest with the words, "Character is always welcome here." The phrase had been suggested unanimously by the membership committee after weeks of thoughtful discussion. No expensive decoration attracted more attention than those simple words. As Grace accompanied her elderly neighbor through the entrance once again, many familiar faces greeted her warmly before she even reached the terrace. The same members who had quietly judged her appearance during her first visit now welcomed her with sincere smiles, respectful conversations, and heartfelt appreciation. Several introduced their grandchildren to her, explaining how they wanted the younger generation to learn that kindness and humility mattered far more than appearances. The club president approached carrying a framed certificate recognizing community service. Grace accepted it graciously before asking whether it could instead be displayed inside the clubhouse as a reminder that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences simply by remaining prepared to help. The president smiled and immediately agreed. That afternoon, the certificate was placed beside photographs from the charity event, not to celebrate one individual, but to remind every visitor that true honor belongs to those who quietly serve others without expecting applause. The elderly member whose safe return had changed everything stood beside Grace as guests gathered for a brief closing ceremony. Looking across the sunlit golf course, he spoke softly enough that everyone leaned forward to listen. "That storm lasted less than an hour," he said. "But the lesson it brought will remain here for many years." No one applauded immediately because the silence itself carried greater meaning than any celebration could express. Grace looked across the peaceful fairways, where children laughed, volunteers worked together, and members welcomed strangers with genuine warmth instead of careful judgment. She realized the greatest victory had never been helping during an unexpected emergency. The greatest victory was watching an entire community choose compassion over assumptions. As the late afternoon sunlight covered Hawthorne Country Club in a warm golden glow, every person present quietly understood that true belonging is never purchased through wealth, status, or appearance. It is earned through character, strengthened through humility, and remembered whenever one simple act of kindness inspires countless others to become better people. Nearly a year later, the memory of that remarkable afternoon still lived quietly within the halls of Hawthorne Country Club, not because people continued talking about the storm, but because they continued living differently after it. New members often noticed the welcoming sign at the entrance that read, "Character is always welcome here," without realizing it represented a promise born from one unforgettable lesson. Longtime members smiled whenever someone asked about its meaning, knowing the answer could never be fully captured by a single story. It had become part of the club itself. Grace Parker never became a celebrity within the community, nor did she want to. She remained the same thoughtful young woman who preferred helping others without attracting attention. She continued assisting her elderly neighbor every week, volunteered at community preparedness events, visited local senior centers, and quietly encouraged neighbors to learn practical skills that could one day help someone in need. She measured success exactly as she always had, not by recognition, but by whether another person's day became a little brighter because she had been there. The members of Hawthorne Country Club also carried forward the lesson in quiet but meaningful ways. Annual orientation meetings for new members now included community service opportunities alongside golf tournaments and social events. Staff members were treated with greater appreciation, volunteers were welcomed as honored guests, and every major gathering included emergency preparedness planning inspired by Grace's calm leadership. The club president often reminded everyone that excellence should never be measured only by beautiful facilities or impressive reputations. It should also be measured by how people treated someone they had nothing to gain from. One peaceful autumn afternoon, Grace returned to the club once again to accompany her elderly neighbor to a charity luncheon. The trees surrounding the fairways glowed with brilliant shades of gold, amber, and crimson, while a gentle breeze carried fallen leaves across the walking paths. As Grace entered the clubhouse, dozens of familiar faces greeted her warmly, not because they remembered the emergency alone, but because they had come to respect the quiet consistency of her character. The elderly member whose safe return had changed everything slowly approached her with a warm smile. "You know," he said softly, "people sometimes believe extraordinary moments change the world. I think ordinary kindness repeated every day changes it even more." Grace smiled gently before answering, "Kindness grows when people choose to pass it along." The two stood together for a moment, watching children laugh outside while volunteers prepared food for local families and members worked side by side without concern for titles or status. Looking across the peaceful course, the club president realized the greatest victory had never been saving one member during an unexpected storm. The greatest victory was the transformation that followed, when pride quietly gave way to humility and assumptions were replaced by understanding. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the perfectly maintained fairways, Hawthorne Country Club looked exactly as beautiful as it always had. Yet those who truly knew the place understood its greatest beauty could never be photographed. It lived in the hearts of people who had learned to look beyond appearances before forming opinions, to value compassion above prestige, and to recognize that the strongest person in any room is often the one who speaks the least, while serving the most. And from that day forward, every guest who walked through those welcoming doors unknowingly stepped into a place forever changed by one simple young woman who never asked to be admired, only to be allowed the opportunity to do what was right when someone needed help the most.